How do you get from this to this? This is Doge Decimator, a website that I made as the artist in residence at Websim, along with one of the co-founders, Rob. Doge Decimator is a game where we recklessly cut government spending, but then have to deal with the consequences. And Websim is the in-browser, AI-native, extremely simple, but also crazily powerful tool that we made it with. Today, I want to bring you into the step-by-step process of how we made Doge Decimator. First, we're going to talk about the ideation process and how we came up with the concept for the game. Then, how we set up the initial game logic, the internal data, and the prompting strategy that we used to approach it. After that, we'll get into the steps of how we iterated on it from version 1 to the final version that you can play online right now. And lastly, we'll end with a couple lessons that you can take from our experiences and apply to any LLM or AI-powered game building experience of your own. We're about to get into it, but one last thing I want to point out. One of the great things about Websim is that every version of the game, from version 1 to version 96, and we'll go through a lot of them, is completely live and playable right now on websim.ai. Here's the link. It's also in the description if you want to follow along. At any point in the video, you can click into any different version that we're talking about. Check it out, look at the prompt word by word, even fork it and build your own thing on top of it. So without further ado, let's get into it. Here is how we made Doge Decimator.
So this was step 0. You got to start somewhere. And this is the chat outline or transcript that Rob made from a conversation that we had. We really just got online one day and started talking about like, well, what do you want to make today? And we were thinking about Doge and how Elon was kind of recklessly cutting a bunch of government programs. And in the context of this conversation, I just started thinking about what games have interesting consequences, right? And here you can see one of the things I was thinking about was Dishonored. There's one mission early on where you get like some rune or bone charm or thing that you need to collect if you poison this well. And then later on in the game, you come back to the town where you poison the well and boom, tons of people are poisoned and your life gets a lot harder. And so we were kind of thinking like, all right, is there some way that we can take that and roll with it and turn that into a core game mechanic, which would be a fun way of kind of critiquing the reckless nature of these cuts. So initially we had a couple different ideas, right? We were thinking maybe it's a text-based game that like uses a lot of AI text generation, a la Colossal Cave, or maybe it's just some kind of thing where you know, it's almost a Jenga-like simulator where you don't realize like when you remove one thing, everything else can be falling down. And then as kind of some inspiration, Rob brought up this game, Journey to the West, that he had made a couple weeks ago. As you can see, it says 2 weeks right here. And it's cool, right? You know, you get a little situation that you're in, and then you have a bunch of options that you can choose and say, you know, want to meditate beneath the oldest pine, seeking inner peace. It takes a second, then the LLM will generate, oh, what's the next thing that happens in the game, right? And then you have like health, karma, etc. And you can, you know, enter in your own action. And this kind of was like, all right, well, we kind of like this idea of like players being presented a couple choices and then needing to figure out like what to do. And so we were thinking, how do we take that and bring it to the government? So the first thing we did was we went and we found a bunch of federal agencies sorted by the amount of federal budget that they take up. And to emphasize the real corner cutter nature of this game, and the game was originally called, the working title was called Corner Cutter. We went through and we just took every federal department on this website, usaspending.gov. We took everything under 1%. And the reason we chose that is just so no matter what you're doing, you're always focusing on something that is such a small fraction of the federal government's budget that even if you were to cut, you know, dozens of these, you wouldn't really make that much of an impact. You wouldn't really feel any savings, but you would deal with a lot of consequences. So the first place that AI really comes into play here when thinking about like AI native development is we have this unstructured list that's not particularly useful for us. So immediately what we went and did was we threw it at ChatGPT. We're like, hey, we have this big thing of unstructured data or mildly structured data. Please go structure it for us. And it did it really well. We had to do a little bit of editing just to make sure that it wouldn't miscalculate or mislabel certain percentages of spend that were very low. And then once we had a big list of all these different agencies that were receiving tiny amounts of federal funding, we also wanted to include in that list for each agency different programs that they ran and different consequences that might happen if you end those programs. And also we wanted to make sure that you used like official actual programs. As you can see, it went on to reason for 13 or 14 minutes. And what we got was something really amazing. We got, you know, for each department, we suddenly had 3 different programs that they ran and different costs that might be if you were to cut that program. Okay, So now that we have the data that we need to base the game on and a general idea of what type of game we want to make, it's time to actually start making the game in Websim. And we really wanted to see if Websim could one-shot this, because Claude 3.7 had just dropped, and we had a feeling that if we did enough work and constructed our prompt in the right way, we could get it working from the jump. So this is the entire prompt. And as you can see, it's the same prompt that we put in here. Here's the prompt in full. So the goal of the game is to satirize a government official who's making a big spectacle of cutting wasteful spending while only cutting small programs and not taking into account the benefits of those programs. The player will, over time, cut more and more funding from more and more agencies, and eventually they'll feel the knock-on effects of cutting those corners. Here we start getting into the game logic, right? First, we want to start with a certain amount of agencies that are all spending below 1% of federal budget. But remember, we've already compiled this list for the LLM itself. And so that's what we're telling you, right? We don't need it to make up anything. We say, hey, import all the agencies as one big object and add some cut statuses to them so we can tell which agencies have or have not been cut and for what reason they were cut. And also make an object to start keeping track of game state, which is just which turn is it, how much money has been cut in total, how much percent of federal budget has been cut, etc. And here's the last section. Here we're just describing the basic logic of the engine for the game that we want the LLM to generate. So the beauty of Websim is that we just took this entire prompt and put it in here. And not only that, but we can actually go back and see what it looked like. So this is the first prompt. This is what happened. And we're clicking through them, select an agency to cut. We select this guy, the Advisory Council on Historic Preservation. Well, I don't care about history that much. And we click submit. We do Department of Education. I don't like learning. And the moon landing was not real. All right, so we submit it. It takes a second, and that's because we're using LLM generation to come up with these tasks, and we'll get to kind of changing that in a bit. But let's try to help our child complete their 8th grade science homework. We can't, we defunded the schools, and that's a problem. As you can see, the first thing that we run into is, okay, how do I go on to the next turn, right? That's a problem. And so small logic fixes like this were really what we did from versions 1 to about 7, along with a bit of styling differences. And you can, if you want, you can go through yourself. I'll put the link in the description. You can go through and look through any of these versions. And you can see we're kind of just explaining what we wanted to do. And it's really easy just to navigate from one version to the next, etc. So now we're on version 7. It looks a little bit cleaner. And we also made it so the user doesn't always have to type something in, but it doesn't feel as careless as the types of cuts that we are trying to lambast with this. And so what would be a very spurious and uncritical and slightly irresponsible means or way of cutting different programs? Well, Rob had the great idea of doing some kind of Tinder-esque interface where you just swipe left and right on different programs. And the great thing about Websim is that you can say, hey, let's make this Tinder style. And within one prompt, boom, we have this. Now, obviously, this doesn't look perfect, and we'll get to the aesthetic fixes that get made in a second. But lo and behold, we can swipe left or right. We can't drag yet, but we'll fix that. And slowly, we just cut or keep different agencies. This is a good time to just stop and say, I'm not going to go through every single different revision that we made. Because first of all, there's 97 of them. And second of all, and we'll dig deeper into this in a bit, but one of the interesting things about building with LLMs is what takes a lot of work and what doesn't take a lot of work. Game logic stuff is pretty straightforward. Debugging things is also pretty straightforward. Those don't normally take a lot of time or effort, but styling often does. And so a lot of these edits most of the time are just minor styling fixes that happen over and over again. So you can see from version 7 to version 15, we have just kind of the same look. And then in the screenshot of version 16, it looks completely different, right? Boom. Wow. Reskinned entirely. So this is a game that's supposed to kind of make fun of the Department of Government Efficiency. So we wanted to look like the Department of Government Efficiency. So we went to doge.gov and we sent it to Claude and we said, hey, Claude, can you please describe in, pretty detailed, but also not code level description, what the styling for this website is to a designer that you might want to hire to reskin a website. And that's what this prompt is. And what's nice about this is without being too prescriptive, it does give a general sense of the Doge website and the wall of receipts that people were talking about without needing to get too deep into the weeds. And so by taking that, we were able to kind of abstract the feel of it and then give it to Websim. And it did a great job, right? If we load this up, as we saw before, it looks great. So now that we have this new skin, a lot of the next edits are minor styling stuff or typo stuff. The next big change came in prompt 29, where we're thinking, this is kind of taking a while, right? So we cut these 4 agencies. Now we're going to have to wait a couple seconds while the LLM generates text. And we wanted this to feel a bit more responsive. We didn't want users to have to wait while they're playing the game. It's just a bad experience. So we decided to pre-fill all the different tasks and potential reasons you would not be able to complete them with Claude. And that worked resoundingly well. So you'll see when we add in this new agencies.json, let's start, cutting different things very quickly. We cut these different agencies this round, and this is going to feel immediate. And that's just so much faster. And that's kind of one of the last big edits made to this game. If you go through versions 43 onwards, you're going to see a lot of stuff about the end screen and making it screenshotable. You'll see a lot of consideration of how it looks on mobile versus how it looks on desktop. But yeah, over time, we were able to get it to a really good spot. And I think one of the most important things to talk about as we get to the end of this part of the video, which is the process of making it, is defining an endpoint. The project is really finished just when the original idea that we had, which is to make a game where you are the person that is cutting different programs, and the consequences of that is achieved, and when that is shareable. And so as you can see, the last couple edits in here are just making sure that this looks nice, making sure that it's easy to see where to play the game, easy to download the results, and in general, make it dead simple to share with your friends. So now that we're done with the process walkthrough, I just wanted to highlight a couple key takeaways about making games and making websites with LLMs in a native experience like Websim that I learned from this process. So first, I think the fact that we got really close to almost one-shotting the game logic from the jump was really interesting. And it highlights an important thing about what LLMs are good at, which is taking natural language and kind of parsing it into some kind of structure that can be translated into code very easily. Obviously, the first prompt didn't work out of the box. We had to make a couple different changes. But all the changes that we made to the game logic were pretty easily integrated, and any bugs were very easy to fix in Websim itself. So I think the interesting bottom line there is if you can talk extremely explicitly in terms of the logic that you want to use to a model or to a machine, and especially to Websim, you can get really good results very quickly by just being very clear about how you want your website or game to work. The second thing that I thought was really interesting is this project really showed me that there's a time and place to use AI in game development and times to not do that. For a while, we were using LLMs to generate different consequences of cutting different agencies on the fly, using it to generate headlines. And these were costly not only in terms of time spent making things load, which is a bad user experience, but also for the Websim team, it costs tokens to them, right? Now, that doesn't mean that there are situations where you shouldn't use AI at all. We had AI generate a ton of stuff for us. Instead of just being on the fly, we had it do it beforehand so that we could load in AI-generated text as our big database on the back end for all the different agencies and departments and programs that they ran, and have the game pull from that immediately and extremely quickly instead of having it have to regenerate it every time. A third thing that I kind of want to highlight is styling. The first thing I think is worth mentioning under that umbrella is, in retrospect, I wonder if we would have had an easier time with styling if we had optimized for that from the jump. We never made any comment that was like, hey, make styling extremely modular and editable so that we can prompt on top of it more feasibly in the future. And I think had we kind of baked that structure in earlier, it might have made the LLM a bit better at getting to the type of look that we were looking for the website quicker. And the second thing, which is more of like almost a philosophical thing, or understanding the difference between LLMs and people and how they interact to create code. I think the reason that LLMs are great at game logic is because game logic is just the sum of all of its rules, right? That's not the case for styling. Styling, when you're trying to style a website, make it look like something, the vibe or aesthetic or look of a website is created by a bunch of CSS rules, but the impression on the user is much more subjective, right? CSS rules are not the DOM. The DOM is not necessarily the thing that is getting rendered immediately on the web page, and what is getting rendered on the web page is interpreted by human eyes and human brains, right? And so when you're working with an LLM, it's important to consider that difference. I'll show a great example of this here. We had this weird text wrapping issue where on mobile it just kind of looked like the text just looked horrible. And it's not like Sonnet has access to the DOM at all times, right? It can tell like kind of what might happen if you made the text, made the window this small, but it can't really implement a great solution. Whereas we can see that, hey, you know, there's a pretty obvious solution here, which is let's make this, instead of trying to squish everything, let's just make this top info bar 2 lines instead of 1. And that way, we kind of do the tough part of styling logic for the LLM. We think of a fix ourselves that can be described in logical terms. And with that, we're able to make a quick, efficient prompt to fix it. And the last and final piece of insight that I had from this was that sometimes if something isn't working, you've spent like 3 or 4 times trying to revise the same div or same canvas or whatever, sometimes it's best to just let the LLM rebuild it from scratch. There are a number of times in this project where I said, I don't like the way that this thing looks. I don't think it operates very well. I don't know how to fix it. Why don't you just take, you know, the result screen, for example, and rebuild it from the ground up, and then we'll start working down from there. And that was a great way to become unstuck. So yeah, that was the build process for Doge Decimator on Websim. Check it out. You can find it on my profile on Websim, which is websim.ai/@WTTDOTM. You can also find it on my website, which is wttdotm.com/Doge Decimator. Highly recommend that you check out Websim. It's a really powerful tool. The community is great. It's extremely open. You can see everybody else's projects, the entire prompt history for them. You can go remix other people's projects. You can fork them. They can integrate your forks. It's an extremely powerful tool for getting different concepts that you have in your brain up and running online, on a URL, on the live internet, in a matter of seconds to minutes to hours, depending on how much time you want to take to put into it. Yeah, I had a lot of fun doing this, and I hope you learned a little bit from it. I will see you in the next one. Peace.